Hello and welcome to Gardening at 58 North. So in this video I'm going to be planting up my cacti trough here. I'm going to give you guys an introduction to all the cacti and succulents that I went ahead and chosen. So I had previously planted up this trough with cacti and succulents, and I've got a video about that. I'll probably put it on the iCard or in the description below so you can have a watch of that if you want to see why I'm planting up this trough. Basically I had a lot of mealy bugs and the mealy bugs were killing off the cacti, and I just had to get rid of them all just to make sure I had none left. What I've done since that video is I've thrown out all the cacti and succulents. I've taken out all of the compost that was in here as well. I then sprayed the whole thing with lots and lots of isopropyl alcohol, then sealed it up in a plastic bag. I've kept that sealed for about 2 or 3 weeks now. That should have killed off any kind of aphids or mealybugs that were in there, and any of the eggs that were from the mealybugs should have hatched and hopefully been killed since then as well. So it should be sterile now, shouldn't be any more mealybug problems. I've checked all the new plants as well. I bought them all about 3 or 4 weeks ago. I've kept an eye on them all, and there doesn't appear to be any sign of pests or diseases, so we should be good to go ahead and plant them all up in this cacti trough. So the trough itself, as I said before in the previous video, it's a homemade one I made a few years ago. The base of it's a very old piece of wood from an old shed. It's over 100 years old. The rest of it's just timber for fencing, and I've just sanded it down, screwed it together. I've also lined it with plastic. You can see some here. That's just to make sure it's waterproof so the water doesn't go through to the bottom. And what I'm going to do differently this time is, last time I had this cactus trough planted up, I had a cactus mix which I then added extra grit to and then mulched the top with grit. Now the problem with that is it was so free draining. When I watered the compost, the water would go straight to the bottom and it wouldn't really get soaked back up by the compost. It would just kind of stay in the bottom, and there'd be very dry patches, very wet patches. It was very hard to water it, especially with the gravel layer on top. Although the gravel layer did look really nice, the gravel layer meant that I couldn't really check how damp the compost was. I did use a probe to check the moisture probe, but they're not 100% reliable, especially if there's quite a lot of salts in the compost, so it was kind of hard to do. And when I did use the moisture probe, I did find some areas were soaking wet, other areas were bone dry, and I'd say that's because the compost was so free draining, the moisture wasn't able to absorb from one end of the trough to the other. So this year I've gone for something very different. So this mix is quite a heavy mix. It's got a lot of peat compost. It's also got quite a bit of perlite just to kind of loosen it up, so it is free draining. And what I've also added is 1 part soil-based compost. It's loam-based compost. I find with that, if you add that to a peat compost, it really helps when you're trying to re-wet it. So the main problem with using pure peat compost is it doesn't rehydrate very well. Once it goes completely bone dry, if you water it, the water just runs straight through it or straight off the surface, and it's very hard to get wet again. Whereas if you mix a good amount of loam-based or soil-based compost in, I find it re-wets really quite easily, and it absorbs the water much better. So I've added that in as well. Now this compost is normally much too heavy and not free draining enough for cacti, so I'm going to have to be quite careful with this mix. But cacti are quite often grown in peat mixes, and you'll see that most of these are actually grown in either a peat or a coir mix, so they are quite water absorbent. You just have to be a lot more careful. When you have a free draining mix, you can be quite erratic with your watering, and you still kind of have a lot of leeway. It's not a major issue. If you overwater it a bit, the water will just run out. You won't have any overwatering. But with this method, if you do overwater it, there's not much I can do because the water can't run out the bottom. It's just going to be sitting in the compost. So I have to be very careful when I do water it not to overdo it. I'm just going to fill up the compost till it's almost at the height I want, but just slightly below it, because when I'm planting these new plants, I'll be moving the compost aside, and that will raise the height slightly, as there's quite a bit of compost in some of these large pots here. So that's the compost pretty much filled up to where I want it, and I'm going to introduce you to the plants that I've gone ahead and bought. So starting up with this one, I've got an echeveria. Unfortunately, this is the only one that doesn't come with an actual proper label telling me what kind of echeveria it is. I'm going to have to look it up in the book, but it's quite a nice one. It's got kind of pink foliage. Now it hasn't been in a lot of light since I got it back in the flat, so it has started to get a bit leggy. You can see there's a bit of a stem starting to appear. Normally this would be completely flat if it had enough sunlight, and the colour would be a bit more vibrant, a bit more pink or red. So this will be really colouring up nicely in the next few weeks when it goes back into the sunny windowsill. It should look quite good. I'm going to have to just keep an eye on it. It should be okay though. It should recover nicely. And as I say, lots of nice foliage, and it gets quite a kind of glaucous colour to the leaves, kind of looks kind of waxy. So I quite like the echeverias. They always do seem to do quite well for me. They don't grow very tall, but they do get quite wide, so that will take up quite a bit of space width-wise in the trough. It'll fill up the whole width, but height-wise it'll stay low until occasionally when it flowers, and then it will get a tall flower spike. So going on to this one here, this is often called a bishop's hat cactus. Just show you the Latin name there. So it's Astrophytum myriostigma. So this is quite a nice one, quite an interesting cacti. A lot of the other cacti I have, they don't have such furry buds when they come up. This did have a few more flower buds, but they did fall off unfortunately. And all the cacti I have gone for are varieties that have particularly nice flowers, large flowers, or they flower really well. So this is the bishop's hat cactus. It doesn't get a huge amount wider, it will get a bit wider, but it tends to just get taller and taller. I've never grown this one before, so it'll be interesting to see how it does. And it's not a massive cactus, so this should be quite a slow growing one as well, but it should have nice big yellow flowers when it does come to flowering. So the next one here is a small aloe. So it's related to the aloe vera, but it's a lot more stockier, a lot more kind of drought tolerant and more desert type. So this is the Latin name for it. It's Aloe peglerae. This is quite a nice one. I've had a similar one in the past. These can get large eventually. They'll probably get at least 2 or 3 times the size of this, and they send up nice flowers. They're, as it's called, red hot poker. It does look like a bit like a red hot poker if you've ever seen that garden plant, or if you've ever had other aloes. It's just got kind of like your classic aloe flower, a big tall spike with red and yellow flowers on the top. So that should look quite nice. Also, again, nice glaucous leaves. This will be quite a slow grower, I think, as well. Aloe vera tends to grow very fast, but I think I had one of these in the past and it was quite a slow growing plant. So the next cactus is this one here, and I've grown this one previously. This I know does get quite large. So this one's a bit of a mouthful to say, but I think it's Pilocereus, Azureus. So this is a nice turquoise coloured one. I've never seen this one flower before. I don't think it flowers terribly freely. The other plants flower a lot more freely than this one. But this grows very tall. It does get quite a bit wider, probably gets at least this kind of width. Once it gets to that width, it just keeps going taller and taller and taller. It grows, I think this can go to a couple of meters or so in height eventually. Probably won't get that high in my flat, but it'll be interesting to see how it goes. I did have one in this trough previously, and it was probably coming on to almost just under a foot in height, and it did grow really fast when it was happy. So this one should be a fast grower, and it just has a nice turquoise look to it. So this next cactus is one I did actually grow when I was a child. I had it years and years ago. I haven't grown it probably for at least 10-15 years. And this is one of the Mammillarias. The Mammillaria cacti are always ones that seem to flower really well. Quite a small cactus as well. So this is the actual Latin name for it, Mammillaria spinosissima. So again, quite a bit of a mouthful, Mammillaria spinosissima. This variety says it has red flowers. The ones I've had in the past have either had cream or yellow or pink flowers. With the Mammillarias, you do get quite a lot of different flower colours. They tend to form a ring of very small flowers, but you'll probably get hundreds of little flowers on a big plant. A small plant like this might get about 10-15 in a ring, and it does that every spring normally, or at least it did when I used to grow them in the past. The other interesting thing with the Mammillaria cacti is the spines are normally curved. This one unusually doesn't seem to show many curved spines, but there are a few here. Hopefully it will show up on the camera. Some of the lower ones have a hook on them. You can see this one just here. It's got a hook, and so you've got to be quite careful when you're near these. If you've got a bit of clothing or even some skin, a normal cactus, you touch it, it'll just prick you, but this one will actually hook onto you. And in the past I have actually pulled quite a few of these plants off my windowsills, because when I've been walking past, a bit of clothing has hooked onto them and they've just kind of come across with me and hooked onto the plant. So that's one to watch with these ones. As I say, this one doesn't have many hooked spines. You can just see 1 or 2. But I have found in the past that normally the whole plant is covered in hooked spines. So this one should flower quite nice for me. I'm looking forward to growing it again. It has been a while since I've grown it, but it is quite a nice cactus. I'll just add, this doesn't get very large. This cactus generally tends to stay quite small, and often with the Mammillarias you get lots of little side shoots coming up. So it's like a little collection of lots of small cacti, not just one individual plant. So this one here is one that I've never really seen before. It's not really a cactus I know well at all. And again, a very difficult Latin name, so I'll try and pronounce it correctly. So this one is Gynocalycium baldianum. And this one, I've looked it up online, has really nice big giant red flowers, especially for the size of the plant. I'm not sure it'll flower when it's quite so small, but it'll be interesting to see if it flowers at all this year. I suspect I'll probably be waiting a little while until it does flower. The spines on this as well are very small. They're not particularly sharp or anything, so they're not going to spike me too badly. You notice I haven't gone for any of the opuntias this time, because the opuntias tend to be a bit big and their spines are really nasty. The opuntia spines have a collection of large spines and small spines. The large ones are really painful and they're barbed, so they stain your skin. But usually when you touch them, they will pull out because they're quite thick and strong. But they also have tiny microscopic kind of hair spines, and those ones are also barbed. And once they're in your skin, you can't really get them back out again because they're so small they just snap off even when using tweezers. So I've not gone for any of those, but I do actually like really light opuntias normally. But just for my windowsill next to my sofa and the fact they get too big, I've not gone for opuntias this time. But this one will be an interesting cactus to see how it does. It's not one I really know. It does look a bit like it's covered in cobwebs at the moment. I'll just keep an eye on that and just wash off any more cobwebs that appear. And it looks a bit dusty, so I might give it a little dust as well. But that's, as I say, Gynocalycium baldianum. And finally, I've got a Lithops cactus, or a Livingstone cactus. I've never actually grown these in the past, and this is probably a little bit small, this plant, for this trough. So I'll keep an eye on it, and I might take it out in the future. But this one is Lithops hookeri. So this one is apparently going to have yellow flowers. I think they do flower quite freely. It'll be interesting to see how it does. And you can see why it's called a living stone. Basically, most of the plant is underground in the form of a stem. The leaves are just these got basically goes in pairs of leaves, big fat leaves. It just sits at the surface. Often the soil is right up to the edge there, so this is a bit more buried sometimes. And it just looks like a stone from a distance. They come in lots of different colours and varieties. This one, I believe, will become a bit more red once it gets a bit more sunlight. And you can see the kind of rough surface, it really does look like a stone. What normally happens with this is you can see that here, there's two more leaves coming out the middle. So often they'll have two leaves, and then another two will come out, and then they'll often start dividing, and you'll have other little side shoots coming out. So these stay really small. This is as tall as it'll ever get, really. It might get slightly taller, but just barely at all. And it'll have a little flower that'll come up every now and again. The flowers are quite big, actually, considering how small the plant are. The flowers are really large. So it'll be interesting to see how well this flowers. It's not one I've had before, so I don't know how well it flowers as a plant. But I'll give you some real good close-ups now, so you can see that nice texture on the leaves. And as I say, I'll be interested to see how this one does. It should kind of clump up, have lots of little side offshoots that come off from it. It'll just stay quite small and well behaved. But because it's so small, it might get dwarfed in this trough. So I'm thinking I might put this in my van as a van plant, or I might put it in its own small terrarium or in its own pot, because this is a really small cactus. In a trough with these other larger cacti, it might be a bit overwhelmed. So I'm just going to space them out now, see what kind of spacing I want. So I'm going to space them out more than I have in the past. I'll probably have two of the larger ones at the end. So I think the Aloe will eventually get quite wide, and so the echeveria quite small. I would quite like it to kind of ramp up a little bit as well. But I've got to, of course, think of my little Livingstone here. I don't want that to get too smothered. So I know this will be quite a nice tall one, and this as well will be quite a tall plant. I want taller ones in the middle. These two are quite this one is a clumping one, so I definitely don't want this next to another clumping plant, because it will take up quite a bit of width. And I probably don't want it clumping next to something else that will get wide, so I'll probably put this one here. This about here. And in the Lithops, I'm actually going to probably put here, even though it's going to be very small and overwhelmed by the other two, these two tend to grow straight up. This will get a bit wider, and this will also get a bit wider. But if I plant it next to something like a Mammillaria, the echeveria, or the Aloe, those plants tend to grow quite wide, and they'll smother this small little Lithops. These ones just grow tall, so this will give it plenty of space. So let's go ahead now and start planting them. So that's the trough now fully planted up with all the cacti and succulents. All I need to do now is make sure there's not any compost on the leaves, dust anything off like that. Also give it a little bit of a watering in, just to let the compost settle down. I put in the compost quite dry, So when I do water it, the compost level will sink slightly. I'll probably need to add a little bit more compost. So some of these might look a bit buried, like this one here looks a little bit deep, but once I water it, compost level will sink down, and then I'll just need to top it up in 1 or 2 places. There's also a couple of dead leaves here on the echeveria I can take off. I'll just keep an eye out for that. That's quite common with echeveria. Once the old leaves get a bit covered up by the other leaves, they just tend to drop off. So I'll probably keep the labels in just to keep myself reminded of what's what. I do know most of these plants, but as I say, it's easier to forget the exact varieties. For example, this Mammillaria, I would know it's a Mammillaria, but to try and remember it's a spinosissima is a bit tricky. So that's it for this update. I'll probably do an update in a few months' time. Probably actually quite a few months. It'll be midsummer, I would think, when these are putting on some strong growth and doing well. If any of them come into flower before that, I'll do an update before. And as for my other succulent plant, I have got another update coming soon for the stone plant. I need to drill out that stone and put a new Pilocereus afro in there to make it look like a nice little tree coming out of a stone. So that's all for this update, and as I say, I'll see you guys in a few months' time.